from Bongumusa is Councillor Tusiye.
Yes,
Councillor Tusi is with us.
Oh,
yes,
Councillor kunjani ma?
Ngiyaphila khethu njani?
Siyaphila nathi. Happy to see you. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, thank you. I'm also pleased to be invited to such a
Thanks
beautiful.
very much. Thanks very much, Councillor. And as I indicated, colleagues, we will start in the next 2 minutes at 12:05 exactly, whilst we're allowing other people to come in. And I'll just like to say hello to Lauren. Lauren, I last saw you in Johannesburg some couple of years ago. I hope you are in good health as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I was excited to see you on the program. Thanks. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, you've been doing this work for quite some time now. And
Don't date yourself.
Congratulations on the professorship. The last time you were not a professor, you were just an activist, that was working on this. I see you've grown some academic feathers from your activism.
It's a way, you could put it that way. Yes, thanks.
Okay, no, that's fine. Can I just get an understanding? Ms. Karina Lokovic from the World Bank, is she here?
Karina is joining us from the States, so she said she'll join just 5 minutes before her time.
I see, thanks very much. And you will remind me of that, right? Even if you send me a note on the chat box, just remind me. And then I just want to check if Mr. Michael Kraus is here.
I'm here. Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mike. Are you well?
I'm keeping well, yeah, thank you. And yourself?
And keeping safe, I hope, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, no, that's fine. Bongumusa is here. He's been like, this guy has really been like ensuring that I'm here on time. Thanks very much, Bongumusa, for that, for keeping me on time. And can I check Mr. Charlton Zirvogel? If I have butchered that surname, I apologize, but I think I'm just checking. Mr. Zirvogel, are you there?
Yes, I am here, and that was quite well pronounced. Thank you.
Oh, is it? Okay. I'm happy. And then welcome Charlton as well. I hope also you're also in good health. Mr. Daniel Dunai from the African Solidarity Network. Is Daniel here? If you're speaking, you are muted, possibly. Okay, let me move and check if Miss Cookie Edwards is here.
Good morning. I just had a bit of Wi-Fi problem, but greetings to everybody. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Is that Miss Cookie Edwards?
Yes. Oh,
excellent.
Actually afternoon, not good morning. Sorry.
Afternoon.
Thank you.
No problem. And then Reverend Ian Booth from the Diaconia Council of Churches. I must just say that the Diaconia Council of Churches is my alma mater. I was groomed as an activist in those walls of the Diaconia Council of Churches way back in the days of the of the United Democratic Front. Reverend Ian Booth, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. And yes, I'm present.
Is the building still solid, and is the work still activists in the Diaconia Council of Churches?
The building is still solid. The work, we are in the process of relaunching our program work. We have gone through a few speed bumps in the last few years, but we're still committed to being the incarnate church transforming society.
Oh, thanks very much. And I hope that the Diaconia itself remains a sanctuary, for people that are otherwise victims that are excluded from the center of society, as was always the case. And I wish you all the luck, and will always support the Diaconia Council of Churches. Thanks very much for being here as well.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And then Dr. Jean-Pierre Misaho, I hope. Jean-Pierre?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Was my pronunciation correct?
Very correct. You got it right.
Thanks. I had bad connections last week when I was joining the session. It was so terrible. I was very unpleased with myself for the better part of your session, but you chaired very well from the voices that I was hearing last week. Thanks very much for doing that work last week.
And then Daniel Dunya is here. He's just joined. He is on the screen as well, I see.
Great stuff. And by the way, colleagues, the community participation session will be moderated by Dr. Paul Karuki, who's the Executive Director at the Democracy Development Program. The DDP is one also such program that has long existed, particularly in KZN, and more specifically in the eThekwini region. Dr. Paul Karuki, are you there? Maybe Dr. Karuki will join in later. So colleagues, it's already 10.
No, I'm here, sir.
You are there. Thanks very much. Colleagues, I've already stolen 4 minutes of your time, but I think all I was also doing was just to make sure that we can hear all your voices. We have about 39 participants in this particular session. And without further ado, I'm going to ask the speaker of the eThekwini Metropolitan Municipality. I prefer to call it the eThekwini Metropolitan Municipality, Councillor Tusi. I hope that's not offensive, because it is a metropolitan municipality, isn't it? So let me hand over to you. Give us the welcoming remarks. Colleagues, you are all welcome in this dialogue on governing for urban inclusion. Last week, there was a session, as I indicated, that was being chaired by Dr. Jean-Pierre Misaho, sorry, I apologize, which was a very well-attended international session as well, in partnership with the University of KZN, as well as the municipality. And I would like to thank the municipality on its continued efforts and ensuring that the topic of inclusivity remains in the radar screen. Can I now hand over to you, Honorable Wezwe Tusi? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stolle, the session moderator and Chief Executive Officer of South African Cities Network, African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Lauren Lando, Professor Makitimisha Shipungu, who is the SARCHL Chair for Inclusive Cities and also academic leader for Planning and Housing at the School of Built Environment and Development Studies, College of Humanities at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Horatia Terraza, Karina Lakovitz, who are World Bank executives joining us from the United States of America, Mr. Michael Cross, the Director for Violence Prevention through Urban Upgrading, Dr. Paul Karyuku, the Executive Director of the Democracy Development Program, Mam Rose Mhlakwana, who is the National Coordinator of the South African Federation of the Urban Poor, which is one of the most founding federations affiliated to Slum Dwellers International, civil society, organized business, representatives from institutions of higher education and research, fellow eThekwini residents, distinguished guests, good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to officially welcome you all to this webinar that reinforces our desire to be an inclusive city where we work together with all stakeholders. We highly appreciate the partnership that our municipality has with tertiary academic institutions, particularly with the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand and other academic institutions within our city, as well as social partners. Governing for urban inclusion emphasizes the vital role and responsibility that we as local government have towards our residents. We are accountable to all people as our mandate is to deliver services in a sustainable manner through good governance and participatory democracy. To set the scene, allow me to share with you what we know about inclusive cities. In its simplest form, we are talking about the right of the city, which is defined by UN Habitat as the right of all inhabitants, present and future, to occupy, use, and produce just, inclusive, and sustainable cities. At the core of this definition are the following components: a city free of discrimination based on gender, age, health, status, income, nationality, ethnicity, migratory condition, or political, religious, or sexual orientation. An inclusive city where all inhabitants, whether permanent or transitional, are considered as citizens and granted equal rights. A city with enhanced political participation in the definition, implementation, monitoring, and budgeting of urban policies and spatial planning in order to strengthen the transparency, effectiveness, and inclusion of the diversity of inhabitants and their organizations. A socially functioning city that ensures equitable access for all to shelter, goods, services, and urban opportunities, particularly for women and other marginalized groups. A city with quality public spaces that enhances social interactions and political participation, promotes socio-cultural expression, embraces diversity, and fosters social cohesion. A city where public spaces contribute to building safer cities and to meeting the needs of inhabitants. A city of gender equality, which adopts all necessary measures to combat discrimination in all its forms against women, men, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in political, social, economic, and cultural terms. A city which takes all appropriate measures to ensure the full development of women, to guarantee them equality in the exercise and fulfillment of fundamental human rights, and a life free of crime and violence. A culturally diverse city which respects, protects, and promotes the diverse livelihoods, customs, memory, identities, expressions, and socio-cultural forms of its inhabitants. A city with inclusive economies that ensures access to secure livelihoods and decent work for all inhabitants, that gives rooms to other economies, such as solidarity economy, sharing economy, secular economy, and that acknowledges the role of women in the care economy. A city as a system within the settlement and common ecosystem that respects rural-urban linkages and protects biodiversity, natural habitats, and surrounding ecosystems, and supports city regions, city-town cooperation, and connectivity. Excuse me, all the things we have mentioned are at the center of how we govern and deliver in our mandate. While we acknowledge the progress in advancing the city, we must indicate that there is still a great deal of work to be done. And it is for this reason that we are hosting this first webinar to look at inclusive cities. We are doing so in order to share best practices and to highlight the areas where we need partnerships in our efforts to advance an inclusive city. To us, an inclusive city is a livable and caring city. Program Director at this point would like to highlight some of the work we are currently doing to advance an inclusive city for all. In eThekwini, we are currently implementing the following initiatives. Service provision for the poor is guided by our municipal indigent policy. This includes provision of free basic services to poor and child-headed households, such as water, electricity, refuse removal, and sanitation. Informal settlement upgrading through the provision of pathways, early childhood support, development support, electricity, water, and sanitation infrastructure. Integrated Safer Cities program in partnership with the South African Police Service. We established a fusion center with a state-of-the-art technology where all law enforcement agencies work together to prevent crime. This is contributing significantly to our smart policing initiative, where the city uses technology to protect its citizens and property. We have also established community safety forums to mobilize communities to be at the forefront of our crime fighting initiatives. We're also implementing social cohesion programs to address challenges of xenophobia and Afrophobia. The city supports informal traders as part of our economy recovery plan. Therefore, we look forward to today's dialogue on governing for urban inclusion. The fact that we have stakeholders across all sectors of the society gives us confidence that we will be able to reflect on appropriate approaches to governing diversity and building eThekwini as an inclusive city. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa is the #1 destination for migrants on the continent of Africa. Therefore, we have an opportunity to pioneer progressive forms of intergovernment collaboration that builds inclusive communities in line with international protocols and domestic constitutional commitments. As the city, we also aim to develop urban spatial frameworks that accommodate the needs of our growing population in terms of land, infrastructure, human settlement, and transport. Our goal is to ensure that people live closer to work and other social amenities. We hope these engagements will result in inclusive and cohesive communities where groups and individuals are able to coexist harmoniously. As a city, together with all our stakeholders represented here today, aim to create an inclusive and safe living environment where people can walk freely without fear of crime, intimidation, and violence. I wish you all robust and fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Speaker of the Metropolitan Municipality of eThekwini, Councillor Weziwe Tusi. We really thank you. The one thing that I would like to pick up from the speech that you have made in welcoming us is the point around the right to the city. It has its origins somewhere in Brazil before it was even adopted by the United Nations as an important prescript in terms of urban development. And it's quite telling that even today we still have that alive. Thanks very much for invoking those thoughts on us. And colleagues, without further ado, I am going to call upon two people lining up one after the other. Whereafter I will ask all of us to engage with them for about 20 minutes after they have made inputs. The topic of their input is governing for urban inclusion. How do we go about doing this thing of governing for purposes of inclusivity? It's a big challenge. Governance is itself a mammoth task for either appointed or elected officials. Civil society organizations have their own perspective as well on what is to be accountable, what is to be inclusive in the process. And without further ado, I'm going to ask my colleague, Siphelele Ngobese, who works at the South African Cities Network and is responsible for the inclusive cities. She is very much fond of the urban safety element as a component of inclusivity. That's her forte. I mean, you'll see her in many media spaces talking about safety in South African cities as a component of inclusive cities. So without further ado, let me call upon Siphelele Ngobese to give us a take, 10, 15 minutes spent, as well as you will be followed by Lauren Landau, who's the professor at Wits focused on migration issues. I've also known Lauren also for a very, very long time. But let me start with you, Spe, before Professor Lauren Landau joins us. Spe, over to you. Okay. At this point, I'm going to switch off my camera just for a while, and then I'll be here. Over to you, Spe.
Thank you very much, Tole, for that very lovely introduction and for sharing the session and holding the room very well. If I may, I'm just going to share my screen so that I can take you through some of the work we're doing within inclusive cities as a response to the theme of today's discussion, which is really a dialogue and thinking together through how do we govern for urban inclusion? And Tole has alluded that I do quite a bit of work in the area of urban safety, but it's becoming apparent that all the different functions and all the different roles need to come together, and that urban safety is just one input to more inclusive cities. So without taking too much time, let me take you through some of what we are doing and some of what we have observed from a research perspective that needs to be forefront of our thinking as we think about governing cooperatively and governing for inclusion. So let me just get this into slideshow mode. Okay, so Sithole has already kind of preempted where I'm going to start, but making the case for inclusion, making the case for collaborative approaches to realizing the developmental vision of cities and why metros, exist. So I'll just take you through just some of the crime statistics, using murder as one of the indicators that we regularly update on, and that's a really good indicator and a way of understanding the state of crime and violence in our cities and what reflections it brings about around space. And the kind of governance mechanisms, the kinds of partnerships that are needed to kind of begin to shift the tide so that cities are successful in terms of the development agenda, in terms of the inclusion agenda, and really in terms of that overall, why we do what we do is so that we can improve lives and change livelihoods in our cities. So you will see here, we have a graph showing the murder rates, and it's a great reflection on just the rates of violence in South Africa. So this is a national picture of murder rates that were at around 69 per 100,000 in 1994, where we've made great progress as a society and been able to almost halve those by 2011, but then seeing a steady incline since 2011 to the present, where we are now, we've moved from the lowest point of 29 per 100,000 and now at 36 per 100,000. And so although we've made significant strides, it's concerning to see the uptick. And you can use that as a lens to understand other crime problems and dynamics as happens in our country. And you will see soon the picture when that is aggregated to the city level and you see a clearer picture of what's happening in cities. So these our city level murder rates. You'll see the dotted line is the national averages at 36 per 100,000. You see that different cities are performing, in contrasting ways on the score of murder and similar to other crime types as well. And for us, this is just a way of advocating around measuring in an urban focus. I had kind of alluded to it in the beginning to say that Cities are economic centers. They are expected to drive sustainable developments and move more and more of our people into sustainable livelihoods. However, they are plagued by high rates of crime and violence. So of the 9 municipalities and metros that are members of the SACN and that we study, they are home to about 40% of the national population, with that only projected to grow, but 76% of car hijackings, 64% of aggravated robberies, 47% of the murders, and you know, the more violent types of crime are more prevalent in our cities and towns than any other locality. And so with that, we advocate very targeted approaches that speak to the social, economic, and spatial drivers of violence and crime. And, you know, this is just going back to why cities are important and why we make a particular case around interventions that are targeted at cities. So it's to do with developmental local government, cities being economic engines, and them being safe as part of the input to making sure that they are more inclusive. Meaning, for example, in the case of women, if the state of crime and violence in cities is as it is, it only means that vulnerable groups such as women, children, people of various differing gender identities, people with disabilities are more acutely affected by some of the challenges that we are observing and are profiling. And so when we say that cities are economic engines and drivers, the ability of excluded and marginalized groups to tap into the potential and the benefit of living in cities is compromised. So with regards to safety and inclusion in the built environment, what we have observed in terms of our research activities is that South African cities have a shortage of quality public space. Much of our public spaces are considered unsafe due to perceived or real crime challenges, homelessness, informal trading, informal settlements, substance use, and criminality are linked to and partly caused by broad structural problems. So we've outlined that these are social, economic, and spatial, including spatial drivers. Also, there's the consideration of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. So these are some of the key areas of intervention that we say we should be driving at in order to turn the tide of poverty, inequality, and unemployment in cities. Further, is that women, girls, and a range of other vulnerable groups that we've mentioned are uniquely vulnerable in public space, with crime and fear undermining their use of and movement in public space, and indeed their ability to participate in urban economies in particular. So when we say that we are working towards 24-hour cities with the current state of crime and violence, how many are able to equitably take part? And so policy documents that link to public space and safety and the roles and mechanisms of public space promotion are not detailed and clear enough. And so those are just some of the institutional challenges and issues that I will go into when I go back to a specific discussion around the theme today. And then open space budgets are decreasing, and creative ways of emphasizing public space can unlock community resources. So for us, this is really a clarion call around partnered approaches, transversal approaches, and really turning institutional culture on its head in terms of, you know, some of the barriers to collaborative practice that I will go into when I profile just what we are finding in terms of our engagements with our practitioners. Sorry, I just need to minimize the screen there. And then, so in terms of our programmatic interventions with regards to space inclusion and the built environment, within the urban safety area, we call for an incremental view on safety, crime, and violence. And so we do quite a bit of stock taking, measuring, and updating of crime statistics and aggregation of those to the city level, really around mapping and analyzing crime problems, their causes, risk factors, and consequences, and what that means for responses, strategies, policies, and practices at the city level and among other actors with the role in safety promotion. We point quite strongly around evidence-based policy and interventions as a result. We call for targeted interventions that are specially focused and that center on partnerships. So we drive quite a lot of messaging around all of society and all of government partnerships, citywide safety strategies, some of the opportunities, challenges with regards to roles, responsibilities, resourcing, and capacities. We look quite intensely within our other pillar of work, that is the built environment integration task team, around the rules that govern doing, the prevailing institutional culture and what it means for us when we implement, and what it means for officials in terms of the barriers, enablers that they are working with in terms of getting things done and working in an integrated way that also leads to integrated outcomes in terms of, for example, human settlements that link to public space, human settlements that link to economic opportunities as well. And around the mainstreaming and institutionalization of partnership approaches. And we've done a bit of work around how to capacitate, how to support city practice with regards to community engagement. Not underestimating the complexities of engagement, but saying that the outcomes far outweigh, the potential outcomes far outweigh the complexities. And just in terms of a policy linkage, we also do work in recognition of that. If you say that all of society partnerships are critical, you then need to empower the participating communities so that they are knowledgeable and are able to activate their voice as well. So in support of Lever 7 of the IEDF with regards to active and engaged communities. I won't dwell.
How much longer are you going to be?
I'm just going to go through some examples now of some of the work that we are doing in recognition of, you know, what are the policy, what are the spatial, what are the social linkages that drive our approaches and how we experience space in South Africa. So recognizing that safe public space results from a combination of inputs around participation, understanding the local context, integrated approaches, and so on. Some of the practices that our cities are involved with and the lessons that we're gaining from some of our cities, including eThekwini. So quite inspiring work being done by the city of eThekwini around a new urban park social model that is inclusive of the park users, that addresses issues of homelessness as an as an integrated approach to public space that is conscious of what's going on at the local level, to the extent that they would integrate homeless persons living in parks, involve them in recycling programs, and create pathways for them to be involved in the economy around them. And most recently, some of the work we've been doing within the built environment integration task team is we've found quite some inspiring examples of what's happening in space when we talk about all of society approaches, local government partnering with actors and local actors and those who are inspired and want to be involved. So yesterday, we recently launched the Good Hood Stories, where we take a view and profile some of the inspiring practices that are coming out, where local actors are partnering with the knowledge institutions together with the local state to come up with some really inspiring things that drive inclusion in a city. So really driving this point around partnership, local action, and frequent and ongoing engagement. So in eThekwini, we profiled the Belhaven Memorial Center in terms of how it's approaching the challenge of substance use in the city in a very progressive way that's not explicitly about law enforcement, but that recognizes the drivers of substance use and really engages from that point. In Cape Town, a bike project happening in Khayelitsha, and in safety and peace through urban upgrading as an intervention in a really complex community in Gqeberha, in Helenvale. If some people in the room might be aware of how complex the lay of the land is in that particular community. And so it's quite inspiring to see that there have been some successes through a partnership approach, similar in Johannesburg in terms of an urban gardening project where the city is partnering quite dynamically. And so these are just some of the projects that we invite you to come and have a view of. And I'm aware, Chair, that time is up and I'm wrapping up. Thank you.
No, yeah, I was going to say, please end on that slide where you are showing the examples of the research work that you have done, but it seems I was also spot on. Thanks very much, Spe, for that particular presentation. And colleagues, I must just confirm that we are 10 minutes late. We started 10 minutes late, but I am going to do my best to make sure that we are able to catch up with the program. So can I now introduce or call onto the podium Professor Lauren Landu, from Wits University's African Center for Migration and Society. Lauren, over to you. If you are able to, just help us with time as well. So if you are able to stop just round around 10 to 1, I will be a happy person. Thanks very much, Lauren. Colleagues, I encourage you, meanwhile, to put your questions in the same way that Matthias has made a comment that she's very happy to be part of this presentation on the chat room, so that when it comes the discussion session, I already have a sense of what type of engagement issues you are wanting to focus on. So over to you, Lauren, and welcome again.
Thank you, Sithole, and making you happy is one of my primary objectives. So I'll do what I can to be quick. I want to just make sure that the screen is sharing properly. Is that?
Yes, it's sharing.
Okay. Let me turn this into a show.
Yes.
And I'll start. Okay, I think that's better then. Thank you, colleagues.
Yes,
I'll try to be very quick. As Sithole mentioned, I've been at this for many years. I would still consider myself an activist, even from an academic position. It just in a different way, one which is founded very much on research and trying to understand from multiple perspectives what is going on. And we've worked very closely with the Cities Network and with SALGA over many years, primarily around issues of migration and governing migration in cities. But as part of that, it's drawn our attention to a range of different concerns, many of which I'll try to reflect today. So I want to do a few things, and I'm going to try to go through them quickly. My colleagues have already begun speaking about what we mean by inclusion, so I'll just speak very briefly about that. We've also seen some of the issues around much of the progress that has been made, but also the lingering inequalities and issues. Particularly in our case, we're concerned with migrants, but I think that there's inequality when we look at many different groups, people who are not getting that right to the city that we think about. Then I think what I'm adding here, I hope to be adding, is really some explanation of that continued exclusion that we see and some practical ways in which we might think about moving forward to try to address those. And some of those are conceptual, rethinking something. Some of them are very practical, and some of them are things that cities can't do, but working together, maybe we can push the system to make changes. So that's where I'm going to go. I'll be very quick, and if there are questions or concerns, you can either interrupt me as we go along, or please feel free to ask at the end. So, I mean, the first question really is, what is inclusion? And we've heard about the right to the city and many of the sort of principles that we get, that when we see that language now, that kind of right to that city, that idea of building inclusive cities, appear in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is obviously is a kind of global approach pushed forward by the UN, and we see South Africa embracing those even before the Sustainable Development Goals, and charging local government with doing many of the things that we now talk about as inclusion. And that, you know, developmental local government, a local government that is really intended to build strong communities. Underlying that, of course, is an understanding of inclusion, and we haven't always been on the same page about what that might mean. But if you listen to my colleagues who preceded me today, and you read South African government's kind of documentation, we see that there are all of these components. I mean, so we want people to be socially included. They shouldn't be stigmatized. They shouldn't be sort of marginalized. We want forms of political inclusion. We want participation. We want everyone who has a stake in the city to have a voice in governing that city. Of course, we want, and perhaps we want more than anything else, economic inclusion. We want everyone living in the city to be able to take care of themselves and their families, and recognizing that people working in the cities are actually not just taking care of people in the cities, but because so many people have connections elsewhere in the country and elsewhere on the continent, the cities are really connected, and the economic driver and economic support for people in rural areas, for people in other countries, for people throughout the diaspora. And this brings up a question of spatial inclusion, where of course apartheid cities are, the legacy of apartheid is that there's extraordinary spatial division. And we have to ask the question of what have we done to try to integrate cities, to try to make sure that people are flowing freely, that there are the public spaces that we've heard about, but also to think about what is the distinction, and should there be distinctions between the sort of narrower city that we talk about and the areas that are part of those cities, the surrounding areas, the small towns that feed the cities, where people have to live because they can't actually afford to be in the city. So there is this sort of spatial component, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. I think if we start to look at kind of how we're doing, we've heard already this morning or this afternoon now that there is great progress, but of course South Africa has not lived up to any of our aspirations in many ways, right? And there are reasons for that, and there are challenges for that. If you listen to some of the people on the street, the reason we're still not making progress is because of immigration. But I think we know that it's not immigration, that the challenges that we are facing, the challenges that we've inherited from the apartheid era, from globalization, from a range of other things, are just are tremendous, and we've not yet got a hold on. And so this is a picture, of course, from Johannesburg. But if we look at cities across the country, there is still this kind of divide, and that divide is not just racial. There are questions of gender that we can maybe don't come out as clearly here, gender, in nationality, class, etc. And all of these continue to be challenges, and we can see that right here if we look at this sort of dependency ratio, the number of people per 100,000 who are basically not working, relying on other people, which is a good indication of how many people are becoming part of that economy. And a bit like the crime statistics, progress was very strong until the sort of early 2010s, and things have slipped. So you can see that in Johannesburg, but even eThekwini, where we're talking about today, issues of dependency becoming more and more acute, fewer people actually being included economically in the opportunities that the cities have. Just to take nothing away from the incredible work that has been done, but to recognize that to some extent, the population of the cities has outpaced our ability to provide opportunities for them, right? The cities across the country, for the most part, have continued to grow, and the opportunities and the services within them have not kept pace, right? And as long as that is the story, we're never going to be able to build the kind of inclusive cities that we want. Beyond economy, part of the consequence of this inequality, part of the consequence of continued sort of fragmentation is of course xenophobic violence. And this is just a kind of crude map from our XenoWatch platform, and Jean-Pierre could tell us more about this. And these are pictures from a couple of years ago from violence that took place in Pilani against foreigners, where they were displaced precisely because they were not being welcomed into the city, not by the city administration, but by the people that they were living with, right? Or their neighbors. And so this is a problem that we've seen in the Durban, eThekwini area. It's of course also a problem that we see nationwide, and something that we need to think about when we talk about inclusion. So we know we have challenges. I don't think anyone would debate that. I would hope no one would debate that. We can, however, differ on what are the sources of those challenges. And like I said, some will blame the fact that immigration has outpaced our ability to grow, but immigrants are only a small percentage of the maybe 3% of the population, and could do very little to explain the continued challenges. The work that we've done over the last sort of 15 years looking at local government responses suggests that there are a number of other things that we can think about, things that we need to address at a kind of administrative level or kind of structural level. I mean, some of these to recognize that municipalities have been asked to do something that is well beyond the capacity of any municipality. Create jobs, create inclusivity, create housing, create opportunities for people. Those are things that cities can do to some extent, but we're talking about an economic system, we're talking about global systems, we're talking about supply chains, we're talking about opportunities that are beyond what cities can do. So cities have to be able to read that and to adjust and to accept that there are certain elements in terms of job creation, in terms of addressing wealth, that they alone can't do, which demands a kind of partnership with multiple other actors. But we also see some things within the cities and the way in which cities are organized that have made things harder. One is the way in which elections take place and people get selected. In the party list system, for the most part, encourages people, councillors in many instances, to be quite absent from the communities that they ostensibly represent. Those who are directly elected then tend to be left as the kind of primary contact point for people. And people want a lot from them. But of course, a councillor is one of the sort of least powerful people in the governing system, with very little individual resources autonomy. And what we've seen is local councillors making promises that they can't deliver, and across the country, often making excuses for why they can't deliver, which has turned to scapegoating different populations, whether that's foreigners or whether that's other group. They have done that as a way of covering for failures of government to deliver what people deserve and what people need. At a more technocratic level, what we've seen is actually a surprisingly little use of data and planning in thinking about how we build inclusive cities. This is not true everywhere, of course, but when we talk about migration, we talk about population projections. We talk about who are we actually building the city for in the future, not just who's there now. We see almost no one engaging with that. Stats SA has tried to develop statistics. Some of them are available, some of that data are not, but it does mean that people are planning more on aspiration than on what is happening. So there's a question of who are we even planning for? And in almost all of the big cities, population has far outpaced the expectations of the planners. And as a result, we're always behind. We're always trying to play catch up. And some of that is exacerbated by budgeting systems, which don't really support municipalities to plan for their future populations. You get resources based on current growth patterns, current populations, current needs, where what we need to do is start thinking about how do we incentivize municipalities to invest for the populations they're going to have in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And that has, as far as I know, has not yet happened. And the last thing here is that gangster governance, right? The kind of governance on the ground that resulted in the violence in Pilani, that resulted in some of the murders that we've just seen, actually pays off. We see people who do these things, whether they're elected or whether they are sort of self-appointed community associations, it works for them. They get resources, they get power, and they're not held accountable. And as long as that continues, we're going to continue to see people mobilizing difference, pushing for exclusion, working for their specific group at the expense of others. That is something that's going to continue going forward. So I'm just going to skip here, right? I think that there's a few things in the interest of time and to try to make Sitole happy. As we continue the discussion today, I think there's a few things that we could do, right? I mean, one is to really think about planning not as a process of addressing past inequality or past exclusion. That has to be part of the story, obviously. But it is thinking, using the data, using projections, and think about what are the cities that we want and who is going to be there. Not who do we want, not how do we discourage people from coming, whether they're South Africans or Somalis or Congolese, but to be realistic about this is the kind of city that we're going to have. These are the kind of resources we're going to have. People recognize how people are using the cities, coming in and out, going from rural KZN into the municipality, coming from other places, moving between cities. These are things that we need to think about and incorporate into planning. And to a large extent, that hasn't happened, right? And mobility, for sure, whether it's international or domestic, is not something municipalities have taken on as part of their responsibility. They don't have to manage the borders, but if you're managing a city, that means you have to manage how people move in and out and the connections that they have with other places. As we do that, we also have to think about some of the structural issues that are in place that need to be addressed. And again, this is not something one municipality can do, but it is something working together that we can do, right? And so part of it is accountability for mismanagement, corruption, violence, false promises, scapegoating, all of those things. We need to hold leaders accountable when that happens. That happens sometimes, it doesn't happen enough, right? But we also, throughout the planning process, has to incentivize the use of data and the use of planning. And as I said, a realistic reading of the city that's broken down not just in these sort of apartheid era categories of black, white, colored, Indian, but that looks at different groups, that looks at language, that looks at gender and looks at multiple genders, not just men and women, but the different ways in which people are excluded, right? And it looks at migration and it looks at migration patterns and includes that, right? And I think lastly, we need to push, and this is where I think some groups like the Cities Network are very powerful. We need to push government to support municipalities to plan for the populations they will have so that the future generations can claim a right to that city, and to try to coordinate not between cities and the surrounding areas, the kind of corridors that lead into the cities and the catchments, the areas outside the city that de facto are part of the urban space, and to start thinking about how do we consider all of these populations, the people we have now and the people who use the city and the people who come in the future as part of building urban futures. So I'm going to end there. I think I'm not too far over time, and I look forward to the discussion and the rest of our conversations. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So Lauren and Spare, there are questions that have been placed on the chat room for your attention. Can I suggest that perhaps what you could do is to start responding to those questions via the chat room? One is from Matthias, who's asking about the extent of refugee inclusion in South African cities, particularly from a human settlement and a housing point of view. The other one is from Tulani, who's talking about the historic apartheid urban design, which is skewed, and its ability to waive access and opportunities away from the poor. That's one question. And I think Marlene Ogawa was just applauding Spare on a great presentation. And he asked, where is the aspect of belonging come in and the psychosocial sense of inclusion? Have any of the presenters looked at this in their work? So I'm gonna ask that you take those questions, please, on the chat room. And I'm just saying this because we are already 3 minutes before 1 o'clock, And I suspect that the best way in which I could get us to be back on time is to immediately bring on 2 other panelists, Karina Lokovitz from the World Bank. I was told that she was going to be here 5 minutes before the time. And thereafter, I will ask Michael Kraus to come in as well. So could I just get an indication, Bongomusa, if Ms. Karina Lokovitz is here?
I'm here. Yes, good morning from Washington.
Good morning indeed. We are beginning the afternoon here. It's approaching 1 o'clock exactly in South Africa. How are you, Karina?
Very good, how are you?
I'm good. You were also in the session that I saw you in the session that was held last week as well. Thanks for joining this session again. Karina, thanks very much. Models of inclusivity, your presentation, we're giving you plus minus 15 minutes to make a presentation. It will be followed by Michael Kraus's presentation, and I will take questions and facilitate a discussion from your presentation and from the presentations that were made earlier before you joined us from Siphelele Ngobese and from Professor Lauren Landu as well. So let me immediately hand over to you, Karina. Thank you.
Perfect. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see your presentation. So please just go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Hang on.
It's not navigating though, so I don't know if you try.
Let me check something. Okay, perfect. This should work. It's navigating now, right?
Try again. It's moving. Yes, yeah, we've seen the second slide.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion and event. My name is Karina Lakowitz. I'm an urban specialist working in the World Bank. I'm connecting from Washington today. And I'm really pleased to be able to share with you quickly some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years in the World Bank to promote gender-inclusive urban planning and design. And we have published last year a handbook for clients and practitioners, which is really trying to set out in very practical ways activities and strategies for urban planners, for people working with communities on urban design, to make our cities more inclusive, more gender inclusive. But really what we find is if you make cities, urban spaces, public spaces more gender inclusive, you make them more inclusive for everybody. So why is gender relevant for urban planning and design? Urban planning and design shapes the environment around us, and by that it shapes the way that we live, the way that we work, the way that we play, that we interact with each other. It really shapes everything that we are. And in general, we find that most of our cities all across the world, they work better for the heterosexual, able-bodied men than they do for women, for girls, for disabled people, and for people of different minorities.
Karina?
Yeah?
There's a noise that's coming from your end. I wonder if there's any movement where you are at all, because otherwise then it's fine, we can continue. It would mean the noise is coming from somewhere and not from you. But I hear now it's quite quiet. So perhaps continue. Yeah,
maybe everybody else could move, but from my end, since it's so early, there's nobody else making noise.
Okay, please go ahead, Karina. We will. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So we really set out to try to understand how can we design and plan our cities so that they work for everybody. And in order to kind of set a little bit the context, I want to point out and really reflect with you on the fact that forever, you know, for thousands of years, our cities have been designed by men. Men have been primarily urban planners, political decision makers, urban designers. And so that reflects the way that our cities are built. And it reflects, we can see that most prominently in the way that our cities reflect traditional gender roles and gendered divisions of labor. So the man that is in the public sphere, that is, you know, working and present in the public life, whereas the woman is in the private sphere, raising a family, being at home. And in ways, you know, if you think about residential neighborhoods and how residential neighborhoods are designed very kind of segregated from other uses of the city, it really kind of reflects and replicates these sorts of divisions for our society and for the people that live in it. The same way that we can see how cities are delineated along the lines of gender, we also know how they are delineated along the lines of race, class, and other kind of separations and divisions in our society. So that's a bit of the context, but if we look even today, only about 10% of women in highest ranking jobs only about 10% of the highest ranking jobs in the world's architecture firms are women. So that male-centered design really kind of continues to be implemented today and continues to reflect, you know, these sort of stereotypes, inequities, and exclusionary practices in subtle and not so subtle ways. So really our conceptual framework in this work kind of departs from that realization, you know. We have a society that is kind of marked with certain inequities along the lines of gender, but also other divisions, which means that certain groups are, you know, have a lack of representation, lack of agency in questions of political decision making, in question of urban planning and design. They are not the decision makers, neither are they oftentimes invited in any consultative meetings or represented in any consultative meetings taking place at the community or urban level for, you know, urban design. That leads to replication of certain kind of ideas, practices, and that are reflected in our built environment. So it leads again to a gender-based built environment, which in turn results in, you know, reduced access, reduced mobility, and other challenges that are faced by girls, women, and minorities of all types in our society. So in that kind of context, we laid out the different challenges that girls and women are facing in the built environment in more detail in the book. I want to kind of jump through those very fast in the interest of time, but they relate to access. Here we just kind of highlight some of the most extreme examples, but we know that women and girls do not have the same access to the public sphere as men do. That doesn't have to be regulated by legal issues, but that in many ways is kind of hampered by a built environment that doesn't allow for, you know, the same aspects of mobility that women need, that are always with strollers or in other caretaking activities, or bags, and the sidewalks are too small. But access also relates to, you know, the visibility of certain groups in our societies, from obviously, you know, transgender people to other minorities that are not visible and not represented and don't feel comfortable in the public space, in the urban public space. Again, we know that women are much more likely to use public transport or to walk, whereas men across the world, in most cities that we have studied, are much more likely to use cars. And yet in most of the cities, the budget really is very much invested in building out you know, highways and mobility for private cars, etc., and not investing at the same time in public transport and in walkability, which also, again, because women rely on these modes of transport, are disadvantaged. As I said before, women are much more likely to walk with children in tow and other strollers, bags, other people that they're caring for, and yet sidewalks tend to be too small to accommodate that, or in many cases sidewalks don't even exist. I live in the United States and I'm always surprised how many cities do not have sidewalks because everything is designed for car use. It's no surprise, we know that women face significant security concerns, both in public transport, but also just in the access to public space. We know that non-intimate partner violence, so violence that does not take place in the home, is most prevalent in urban settings, most prominently in informal settlements, more so than in rural areas. Again, gender-based violence is enabled by the built environment. An example is lack of lighting at night that makes it not only uncomfortable for women to walk, but effectively increases security concerns for them. Issues of health and hygiene in many countries in the world, women are responsible for fetching water, and the longer that infrastructure is away from the house, the more difficult that is, and again, it disadvantages women, has other repercussions in terms of their economic and social opportunities. Same with access to toilets. I always like to use the examples that women are, we know based on many studies, women use the toilet more often than men, and they use it longer. And yet in the majority of restaurants or majority of public spaces, the male and the female toilets is the same number that are being built. Even though what would much more make sense, scientifically speaking, is to have maybe 2 or 3 toilets for women versus 1 toilet for men. But we don't incorporate these sorts of this awareness and this knowledge into the way that we design our spaces. Issues related to climate resilience. We know that when disasters strike, more women tend to be killed than men, and women at an earlier age than men. And gender-based violence is also found to rise during and after disaster. And finally, issues of security of tenure, which are not surprising, and also relate again to the urban public space. Doesn't have to be restricted by legal disadvantages, although that is the case in many countries still, but also through custom or through economic lack of economic opportunities. In most countries, women do not own the property in the same measure as men do. So I will skip through these to kind of get to the commitments that we have made as we were writing this book and set out these different activities to promote gender inclusive planning. That I think is very, very important for us to kind of, if I can leave you with one message, then I would like it to be this. We can talk about certain elements of urban design that we can recommend to make our cities more gender inclusive, wider sidewalks, more lighting, more investment in public transport. But the most important thing really is that in order to make a city gender inclusive, it is important to make any urban planning or design that's taking place. If it's at the smallest neighborhood level or at bigger infrastructure investment, needs to be based on a participatory process, and a participatory process that really kind of not just by lip service, but really actively integrates the voices of girls, women, but also again other minorities. And what I mean by that is that we have to try to begin to understand how girls and women and other minorities today use the city. Where do they go? Where do they not go? And what would be their preferences in terms of changing the city? What would be their recommendations if you build a new bridge, to include sidewalks or pedestrian ways, etc. So it really is about including women. I think that is the most important issue that I would like to kind of leave you with, as well as obviously issues of universal design, which also is kind of equally important for us. I will come to an end here. I just want to make sure that you know that in the guidebook we have set out a number of activities that help to kind of integrate and entrench this perspective of inclusivity in the planning process from the earliest stages through to the very end, monitoring and evaluation, something that we've just also heard about. We are describing a couple of activities that have effectively kind of been able to include the voices of women. One of them is the star diagram, where we ask how women feel safe and access the public space. Walk audits are super important to understand, as I said, how women use and perceive the public space, something that many urban planners and designers today don't have time for. And then finally, we have a long list of case studies in the book of cities that have successfully integrated a participatory approach into their urban planning work, and have also kind of been successful in certain kind of changes in the way that they plan their cities that have made enormous amounts of difference in the way that women feel, that they can access the public space, that they are welcome in the public space, that they feel safe in the public space. With that, I leave you because I see that in ways I'm already coming to the end of my presentation, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Karina. Are you able to stay on for the next 40 minutes or so?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, because what I would like to do is to bring in Michael Kraus, who will make his final presentation. Sorry, who will be the final presenter in this segment of the program. And then when we have a facilitated discussion, there will be more questions, I presume, that will be coming from the floor. Also, could you please just post on the chat room the website where we can access the report that you are making reference to, Karina, right? So that we can just easily download. Okay, colleagues, without further ado, let me bring on Michael Kraus. Thank you, Michael.
Hey, good afternoon. Sorry, I was struggling to find the mic. Thank you very much, Program Director Situla. I would like to take you on a little bit of a journey down to Cape Town, all the way from Washington down to Cape Town, and talk a little bit about promotion of social cohesion through urban planning, with particular focus on informal settlements. I've structured the presentation in 3 parts. Initially, I will give a little bit of background so that we have some foundation and common understanding. Second part is about that particular case study in an informal settlement called Monwabisi Park. It's about 25,000 people. And the third part is about how did COVID actually influence? Because we're sitting right in the middle of the 3rd wave. Some of us are not in the 3rd wave in the Northern Hemisphere, but certainly in the Southern Hemisphere, we are in full grip of COVID, and how does that impact? So let me go into the presentation. So the idea is to co-create obviously safe and sustainable neighborhoods to improve the quality of life for residents. And it's really around urban spaces. I'm very thankful for the previous speakers that have really laid a very strong foundation. And if you just looked at the stormwater detention pond, and all the houses are basically facing away from the public or the urban spaces, the public sector. If you look at that's the same space a couple of years later, through negotiated developments, through dialogue, we were able to transform a backspace towards the center of a settlement. Obviously, it's socially activated at day and at night, so to make it safer. Currently, it feels that we are having three challenges, which some people call the divides. We got a social divide, we got an ecological divide, and I think climate change is quite ripe, and we all experience it. And it's a spiritual divide. And with the programs that or with a project that I will describe today, we're covering a couple of things, particularly looking at community participation and how to do urban inclusion. So it's the question around ownership. Is it public owned? Is it commonly owned? Is it privately owned? What type of governments do we have? What kind of leaders are we having? And I really like the phrase of gangster governance early on. I learned something here. Thanks, Lauren. It's the question around technology. How can technology help us? And how do we sort of put in capital that we all got, be it human capital, be it financial capital, into a development? So our response, and most people know that, is structured in 4 elements. There's an element around prevention. There's an element around cohesion, and I think that speaks very strongly to the topic we're talking today. There's an element about protection for safe communities, and there's a question around, or the element around evidence-based interventions. That's clearly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, and in the South African context, to the White Paper on Safety and Security. And I think Sibilila has made a very strong case for the White Paper earlier. If you look at the participatory model, and I don't want to dwell too much into theory, all I want to say as an organization, as the intervention that we are doing, we're striving for what's called a negotiated development that requires an open government to make itself vulnerable to communities, to citizens. It looks for complex decision-making elements. It is quite a diffuse system that requires often a moderation, and that's where we as organization come in as an intermediary. And it looks towards integrated systems and approaches. Other speakers were talking about the whole of society or whole of governance or government models early on. So negotiated development is a very diffuse concept, and it's probably the most difficult one because you have to listen and you have to respond to particular situations. So it's not the cookie cutter system where you have an intervention which you then replicate and think you can change the world. It is really context and people specific. And that's really what we're trying to do on an area-based level. It's around people-centered interventions. What are the people needs? It's based on evidence, what's there, what is the situation, scoping the landscape. It's around the context. So how do people and spaces relate to each other? It is the multi-sectoral approach, so the difficult one, so that you include all the sectors. Takes longer, but bears more fruit. And it's around partnerships and partnering. On the one hand side with the community, on the other hand with government, with private sector, with the civil society. Main point is that you interact as equal partners. So let's go into Monroe BC Park as the case study. I think we spoke a lot about urbanization, but the reality, I'm just showing the reality over the last 10 years of one informal settlement at the periphery of Cape Town. It's close to Khayelitsha, and some of you may know it. So when in 2011, we had about 6,500 households. Initially, there was an infill. So you can see that government or the city was able to contain the expansion, but we could see an increase already of about an extra 20%. In 2017, it started to encroach on the edges. And then in 2018, there was a clear land invasion towards a bordering nature reserve. And in 2019 and 2020, you can see an extreme scenario. So the settlement has in essence more than doubled over the last couple of years, but that's reality. And Lauren spoke about what type of and how do, what cities do we want to see in future. And we can do all the planning, but the reality is basically with us and around us. So what are the types of intervention that you can do in a participatory approach in a situation like that? What you see here is an aerial photograph of the same settlement, a very small intervention. You see the simple thing that we were also talking about just now from a gender-based perspective. So it's a street that we're looking at, and it's a pathway. Through that discussion with the local leadership, we came up with particular examples, and you can see that we actually played the city with Lego blocks if you look at the pictures. And we took the simple interventions of basic services, water, and the relationship between water provision of water as a basic human need and the need for public spaces. And what you can see is on the left-hand side of this picture, you can see the provision of a water tap by the city, or let's simplify it by the public sector. And you can see it's dysfunctional. So it was not responded to the people need. In the center of the picture, you can see actually the people's response. And it's a very simple response. It's a hose pipe. Why a hose pipe? Because in the Cape weather, it's a lot of wind. And if your water tap is about 1 meter high, and you got a bucket that you put at the bottom of the on the floor, half of your water is actually, the wind dries half of the water out of your bucket. So you start to hang your bucket onto the water tap, and obviously the water tap will break unless you put a little bit of a hose pipe, which you can see on the right hand side. So that's just a side note around design. And I fully agree that obviously this water tap has been designed by men and not by women, because women would have done it properly. But here you can see what we came up. We basically started a small space around the water tap, which has a little bit of a table. So it was designed by women, and you can see it got the right measurement. So you can actually use it for washing, and you can use it for activities as well. So it gets activated in our particular case through early childhood development, and you can see people are sustaining it. So the community is using it and looking after the spaces. So just to come back where we started, so how does it land? It actually lands as a small walkway. It ends as an emtungeni, as we call this, public spaces, and another emtungeni. So you can see suddenly we have that guerrilla urban design, if you want to call it, that looks into an informal settlement, is informed by the community needs. At a bigger level, we got small precincts in informal settlements, the same informal settlement that you're looking at, which got a neighborhood center on the left-hand side. We've got a great art classroom right in the center. So you can see it's that lifelong learning that we're trying to promote, as well as you can see two sports fields that are well lit and utilized by the community. So if you look at a systematic approach, you can see that we started with a public space. Often it's a safe public space that's utilized as a sports court. It's an active box, and then you got the add-on.
Michael, apparently you are coming across in a very soft tone. Could you please just raise your voice?
Okay, I can try that. Can you hear me better now?
Perfect.
Okay, I'm sorry. I won't start again, but I just continue.
Right.
So you got a safe public space, you got an active box for your precinct, you got something around early childhood development that looks at the progression of the people living in the informal settlement, and you probably got a playground or an urban garden for that matter. So that's where we are. So you got an intervention that's based on the needs of the people through a dialogue, through a conversation, through a communication, and it's based on evidence. Obviously, what hit all of us last year was the COVID crisis. And we were in a fortunate situation that we were able to respond to it in a structured manner. So what we started is we looked at how can we respond to COVID and see it actually as an opportunity to rejuvenate community circular economy. So how can we make sure by the resources that we bring in or other donors are bringing into a particular community that we can rejuvenate that? And it's a very simple approach that we were looking at. We were looking at how can we make sure that the nutrition of early childhood development is sustained in a particular area. And that was done through vouchers, and we integrated a couple of spaza shops. So it's all around the community needs, sitting around the table, discussing it, And nutrition was the primary thing for early childhood development that the community responded. We then basically had that voucher project, so 300 Rand, which covers about 80% of the nutritional needs for a child for 2 weeks. And we gave that twice per month. So in a month, a family would get 600 Rand. And you can see there's a whole network that works with it because those vouchers need to be redeemed and the redemption happens in spaza shops. But I would like to focus later on Wi-Fi and how Wi-Fi can actually enable some things. So the response that we driven was for about 20,000 people, or is for about 20,000 people. We're still extending it until the end of September. We work with 232 ECDs. So now you can see it's quite a bit of an impact. Close to 13,000 children and ECD teachers. Problem in South Africa is, as you probably know, ECD teachers fell through the cracks. There is no UIF, etc. It's often 99% of the ECDs are run by women. So there was a big danger that we actually widening the gender gap if we're not into sector. So we were supported by a couple of organizations. Second cohort that we supported was pregnant women. So important for children to develop while they're still unborn. And we supported about 3,000 ladies. We ramped it up to about 4,000 ladies right now. And it started to become a field study for the argument that currently sits with Parliament to introduce a pregnancy grant so that pregnant ladies from particular social backgrounds actually get the support of a grant so that the child, the unborn child, gets proper nutrition and can fully develop the brain functions. Wi-Fi, I will talk about that, and that was linked particular to early childhood development again. How can we continue early childhood development if the ECDs are closed, and how can we connect it so that we get certain standards of education, because that's the future of the country. Food kitchens are direct and immediate response. You can see is about 14,000 meals are being provided on a daily basis. And then working with spaza shops. So in the communities that we work, the 8 communities that we're working in, we pre-approved about 120 spaza shops, so they got branded and you can redeem your voucher. The intended byproduct, and it's good that Lauren spoke about migrants, is that about 80% of the spaza shops that we recruited are actually foreign-owned spaza shops. So we're ensuring that there's an integration as well between South Africans and foreigners as well. And last but not least is how do we restart a little bit of the economy and look at nutrition and support through urban gardens. And again, looking at urban agriculture, we work with about 70 food gardens. And now you can see sort of the system developing. If a food garden produces for an ECD, you got a Wi-Fi network and so forth and so forth. So you can see that we're trying to keep the economy running in the wake of a crisis. So we didn't introduce a new idea. There was a bit of Wi-Fi that we were able to provide in 2019. And that was obviously linked to public spaces so that we could activate the public spaces in the informal settlement. And in the north of the picture, you can see an area, a formal area called Harare and Kailicha. In 2021, so in the middle of the COVID crisis, we were actually able to provide more Wi-Fi so that people get better access to information. And as I said, we linked it. You can see the yellow stars are all the ECDs that are now Wi-Fi enabled. So that allows now an interaction between ECDs, but also allows interaction between us or the state or whoever wants to with the communities that we're working in. Monthly users are really jumping up. We currently, those are the figures up to March. We're currently sitting at about 20,000 users. It's really growing exponentially because the service is now fully up and running. Obviously, in the back of that, and it's coming back to the conversation that we're having here, what is the integration? What's the community participation? What's the community dialogue that you can enable through Wi-Fi? It's simple. We can now upload in real time the functionality of basic services, water taps and toilets. We can run a community register so we know who's living in a community, what are the needs of the communities, and we can continuously do household surveys. So what I was trying to say is in the presentation on the time that I had is it is important if you want to do a people-based or people-centered upgrading of informal settlements, concentrate on the public domain and first put most of your resources into public spaces, because that's what's going to stay, and leave the private spaces for the people to develop it for themselves. Enable through basic services, but include in the basic services, and we got a very narrow definition in South Africa, which is driven by infrastructure needs, but not by people's needs. So we don't have public health and safety standards in our basic services. We don't talk about quality of life, or very seldomly. We don't talk about social equity, and certainly not around environmental sustainability. We're driving for economic sustainability, and a little element that we could contribute was through the work that we did in the COVID response, creating those circular economies. And what's important for us is really to start a systemic approach that looks at urban inclusion, that is based on listening to our colleagues, to the community, listening to the public sector, communicate, and then start a negotiated development between citizens and a public sector and governance and government. The approach is really to start small, look at things, prototype them properly, and if they work, then you can scale them. So I was able to give you some feedback and some insight into the work that we're doing in bringing that urban inclusion closer to the people that are arriving on a daily basis in our cities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much for that present. I'm just trying to change. The sun was burning me a bit there. Colleagues, thanks very much, Michael, for that presentation. I'm hoping, Bongumusa, that we are going to gain access to all the presentations that are being made during this session, right? Please confirm that for me.
Yes, we'll share them post-decision. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Colleagues, can I ask that you, by show of hands, and colleagues Bongumusa in the Secretariat, you should help me if I'm unable to identify any names. But let me go back to Spelele as well as Lauren. You had questions that were put on the chat room. I did notice that there was an attempt to answer them from both of yourselves. Do you want to just have a response on some of the things that were said earlier? I won't go back to the questions themselves. So perhaps ladies first, let me start with Sibele.
Okay, thanks, Itole. Yes, so I will group, so the questions that were directed to me in particular were kind of similar in theme. So I'll group them, one from Marlene and one other person whose name I've now forgotten. So Marlene was asking a question around issues of belonging and connectedness. So the more softer aspects of inclusion and how we are dealing with them and how we have sight of them as the SACN. So, you know, I think even in terms of the harder aspects of driving inclusion, you achieve the softer aspects. So in aspects like non-motorized mobility, safe, affordable transport, housing, human settlements, sanitation, those are some of the things through which you can rightly drive and unlock a sense of belonging and connectedness and inclusion in the broader sense. In terms of our own engagements, these are some of the areas on which we engage, but there's an additional aspect around participation, voice, access and the more procedural aspects of inclusion. So in being included in processes as well is one of what we think are some of the key aspects of unlocking belonging, connectedness, the resilience of cities themselves, and the sustainability of inputs and infrastructure investments that are made. And in so doing, we also have a growing and quite a strong view of well-being as a critical aspect of inclusion in a city. And so that is the vantage from which we approach driving inclusion in cities. So through the harder aspects, and I think we are anchored and supported by our constitution and policy in terms of how it has a tacit acknowledgement of some of the rights, dignity, access, redress aspects and the foundations of what we do, being precisely around rights, dignity, access, redress. And so things like connectedness, belonging are implicit. And so, for example, how we conceive of the function of housing, whether at the national level where it's dealt with as human settlements, and in terms of the implementation at the city level, it's supposed to unlock precisely that, a place where you can be in peace, and you can secure your well-being and your access to other goods such as the economy, education, and all those life affirming and things that really reinforce your belonging in a society. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Well, you have made considerable value input into the discussion. Thanks very much, Spare. Lauren, there were questions that were directed at you. And by the way, I must say that there are also questions directed at other people, but let's start with Lauren. Lauren, there were questions that were directed at you, and I'm sure you've had sight of those. Just take the opportunity to respond. I noticed that you did respond somewhat on the chat room, but just take another minute or two, perhaps to place emphasis on some of the issues you couldn't place emphasis on in writing. Over to you.
All right, thank you. I think the only point I want to make here is that when we look at city planning, we look at planning for inclusion. We have to take, Michael's presentation was wonderful, and it shows the growth of the city. And these are, we have to plan for the cities we're going to get, not the cities that we want. We have to plan for the people that we're going to get. And one of the things we've seen over and over again in the work we've done in South Africa is that the most vulnerable in the city are South African citizens. So refugees and migrants from other countries, they face various forms of exclusion, but we don't need special programs to plan for them. What we need is plans for citizens, right? That the people who really struggle to access housing, jobs, water, are often South African citizens coming from rural areas into the city who don't have the resources, don't have the connections to make it. It doesn't mean that refugees and others don't face real obstacles. They do, and real discrimination and sometimes violent discrimination. But it's really about thinking to fulfill the duty of local government to plan for the people who are coming to cities. That means planning for citizens. And we need to understand those kind of obstacles, from the various micro design obstacles that Michael was talking about to some of the budgeting, political sorts of systems that I was speaking about before. So that's just what I would emphasize, that as much as ACMS and others talk a lot about immigrants and refugees, the really vulnerable populations in our cities are new arrivals who are South African citizens, who are entitled to everything, who have every right, and who should be the primary objective of local government. So that's where I'll stop. Thanks, Tobin.
Okay, thanks very much, Lauren. If I may just go again onto are there any hands, Bongumusa, that you see from your side? I don't see any from my side. I suspect people have opted to use the chat room rather. Okay, Matthias, you have quite a number of questions and your hand is up. I'm hoping you're coming up with newer questions and not the ones that you've put on the chat room, because the ones that you've put on the chat room we've seen and they will be responded to. So let me hand over to you.
Thanks very much, sir. I wanted the figure, and then I never got the figure. What I wanted when we talk about inclusion of refugees, because these are people who by the law must be accommodated by the South African government. I wanted a figure and I'm not getting it. I'm asking from the past 24 years, how many? Just give us a number of refugees who have been accommodated. That's simple like that. Pass aside won't work, but I just need a figure. Thank you.
Is there someone in the room that has an authoritative figure of how many refugees are in South Africa? Anybody, any volunteers? Anybody that has that information in the room, feel free to just chip in. Anybody? It seems there's no one that has that. Okay, Lauren says there are approximately 45,000 refugees in South Africa. That's what Lauren says. It's in the chat room, Matthias, right?
Are those refugees accommodated by the South Africa in terms of housing or just a number of refugees?
I think it's the number of refugees. I'm not sure if Lauren is able to help us with how many are accommodated, how many are not accommodated, but he says in the chat room, very few access public housing. So very few, but that very few is not a number, right? But few of the 45,000 have access to public funded housing. Thanks very much, Matthias, for that question. Okay. The floor is still open, colleagues, for especially people that were in the panel to make additional commentary before I asked Dr. Paul Karuki to start preparing to come on board. We have about 10 minutes before you come on board. Michael, as well as, let me start with Michael. Michael, if you go to the chat room, there were quite a number of questions that came your way. Let me go to the chat room. Michael, do you want to take some of those questions? And by the way, colleagues, Karina did post on the chat room the website for the document that she was making reference to. So please make use of that. She was followed by Spare. Also had a posting that she did yesterday. The Cities Network was hosting a premiere cinema movie where they were showcasing case studies from a number of South African cities on how they're dealing with inclusivity. Michael, are you ready to take questions, rather to start responding to some of those questions, please?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, the one question what I took out of the chat was around foreign nationals and refugees and ownership of spaza shops. Yes, that was intended. We didn't provide food, or we don't provide food parcels, and we can have a long discussion about that, but just bear in mind the logistics and the cost for logistics. We try to cut out, and you actually, if you put food parcels into a community, you destabilize local economic systems. Also be mindful of, with very well intention, you can also do quite a bit of harm. So the intention was to put cash into the community and guide it, and indirectly or directly discriminate positively towards spaza shops. So the vouchers are limited to spaza shops. So you're making sure that the funding goes into the local community and is utilized there, and you're enhancing local economic development, if you want to say that, on a very, very micro scale. That's correct, yeah. So we don't discriminate. So also foreigners who had children or have children in the ECD sector got it. It was irrespective of your local, as long as you lived in that community, same as pregnant women, etc. So that was also the intention, to go beyond what government provides with the COVID relief measurements, so that we are an inclusive city and respond to the people that are in the city. Thanks.
Okay. At some point, I am possibly going to ask Councillor Weziwe Tusi to make some of the closing remarks just for this particular segment. And that is there's a comment in the chat room, Councillor Tusi, which says there are lessons for Durban to learn from. And I'm asking, I'll probably ask you to come on board towards the end. From the political side, I know that in the next segment, Bongo Musa is one of the people that will be in the panel talking to what lessons eThekwini can take in order to become a much more inclusive city. But from a political side, I think towards the end of this segment, I'll probably ask you to come on board. Bongo Musa, at some point you had your hand up and it's still there. Good. Bongo Musa, where is your comment or question?
I mean, thanks, Esther, and thanks to leadership and colleagues who are in attendance. I would have loved to ask Michael that how did the ECD, you know, if you say the early childhood development centers are for all inclusive people who are found in a community, whether they are South African or they are non-South African residents or nationals, how has that having our children in one place start to further the social inclusion and allow parents to engage beyond whether they are stereotypes or their inherent hatred of other, when their children have no South African or non-nationals, they just know other kids, and now as a parent you are now in that particular space, how that has facilitated social inclusion and interaction from the ECD as a center and then vibrate toward the community.
Okay, I think that's a great question, but I think, Michael, just don't limit it to South Africans and non-South Africans. And I'll tell you why. As Lauren alluded earlier, discrimination and exclusion takes place within South Africans, right? I mean, I'll tell you, I've been in Johannesburg for possibly 18 to 20 years. I'm still regarded as a migrant, being a South African by Johannesburgers. And I'm sure it happens in across all South African towns, cities, and villages, that if you're coming from outside for a very long time, almost a generation, you get to be regarded as an outsider. And so hence I'm making the point, let's not limit Bongo Musa's question only to a South African vis-a-vis a non-South African. Let's just talk about people that have not been part and parcel of the city. Over to you, Michael. Bongo Musa, feel free to drop your hand, my brother.
I think, Chair, it's a very good question that Bongo Musa posed to me, and I'm sitting in that question and I'm trying to find answers. I think you almost gave me a task for the next 15 years here, Bongo Musa. It is the public, but on a serious note, what are the places of interaction where we have unrestricted access? It's coming back to the public spaces. So we have to make sure that the public spaces are accessible for anybody and that the limitations are very, very low so that everybody can access it. And I think you hit the nail on its head. If we want to see a different country, we have to start with the children and teach and learn from each other. Different behaviors and different tactics, how we deal with situations. I have to disappoint you with my, we haven't done any research, but certainly you have triggered many thoughts that were going through the head, but you formulated very great. Thanks, Bongo Musa.
Yeah, and I think through children, new languages develop. Now the cultural dimension pops in there. They develop their own lexicon. They develop different ways of interacting away from the previous generations or generations that have given birth to those children. I think that's a good way of also tackling this. As the last the person to comment is Councillor Tusi. Are you still there? I see you're still there. Do you want to have the last word before I end this segment and allow people to take a body break? And I must say that I'm also going to be excused, colleagues, to go to my next engagement after this segment. Councillor Tusi, your last political comments, by the way, right? Ubongo Musa will deal with the administrative part, but I think that the politics of creating a non-racial, non-sexist, non-discriminatory, non-gender discriminatory society. And how far are we from that vision, the vision that was articulated in 1955 in the Freedom Charter?
Thank you so much, Tole. Thank you for giving me an opportunity. And I'm sorry I was multitasking. I was in another meeting.
No, that's fine. That's totally acceptable.
Okay, but I want to say we are committing ourselves. I know we've got some of our partners there, or Cookie Edwards, about the issues of gender activism, of fighting against gender-based violence and all such issues. And issues like empowering of women and all the other vulnerable groups. We are committing ourselves as a city that we will be working together with our stakeholders to ensure that what we had promised, from what you said from the Freedom Charter and all our manifestos as the ruling party, that we will ensure that working together with them, we will be able to win and ensure that we do make our commitments real. Thank you.
Okay, and colleagues, I've deliberately chosen to make reference to the Freedom Charter because the Freedom Charter is quite foundational in how our constitution was crafted in the post liberation movement phase. So indeed, thanks very much for a great interaction. The spectrum, starting with yourself, Councillor Tusi, thanks very much for the leadership and the support you are providing to people such as Bongo Musa. They give me sleepless nights, Bongo Musa. They phone me at 10 p.m., to say, you have to do this and that. Thanks, Bongo Musa, for that. Spelele and Lauren, colleagues and comrades, thanks very much for the commitment that you have shown to the agenda of inclusivity and the work that you are doing, Lauren. Please keep it up. I think it's quite important. I would also like to thank Karina for waking up very early in the morning and joining us. And again, Karina, I must thank you for having been part and parcel of the session that was there held last week in conjunction with the University of KZN, as well as Michael Kraus. Thanks very much for all of your inputs. Michael, your inputs are extremely educational. They're technical, but extremely, extremely educational. And I think there's a lot to learn from them. At this point in time, I would like to hand over to Dr. Paul Karuki. If he could just be on screen, he will then take us forward beyond this point into the community participation session. Dr. Karuki?
Thank you so much, Mr. Stolle, for that great session that you've facilitated.
Wow, what a lovely picture behind you there.
Promoting our city.
It's one of the icons. You wish it could be used to get us to be more inclusive, isn't it?
That's the thing. That's the thing. So thank you so much.
I'm now handing over to you.
I really appreciate it very much. What an insightful session we've had. And thank you, colleagues, for staying this far. We're going to start the next session exactly at 2 o'clock. So I'd like to offer you some 5 minutes for body break, and then let's reconvene exactly at 2 o'clock and to continue the last session of our engagement today. So be free to take a comfort break, and then we start exactly at 2. Thank you so much. We're able to take off. And so again, to welcome all of you again back to this afternoon session. And this is the session where we're going to talk about the practical aspects of inclusion from a stakeholder's point of view. And we are very much honored to have a good panel of colleagues who have extensive experience of working on issues of inclusion in the city. And I'm going to introduce them shortly. And I would like to suggest, like we did in the first session, feel free to note your comments in our chat room and any questions as presenters will be giving as the panelists will be giving their input. And then we're going to follow the same format we followed in the first session, where we'll give you an opportunity to not only just to ask questions, but also to make input while the panelists respond to those questions that you will have asked them. And so I'm looking forward for the next 55 minutes or so to have this insightful engagement and hear from our panelists some of their thoughts around issues of inclusion as we have had in the first session. So we have Mr. Bongumusa Zondo, as all of you may know him. He needs no introduction. He's very well versed, and I'm just going to do justice just to give a brief background of his work, and then we're going to the other panelists. So Mr. Bongumusa Zondo is a senior manager.
Sorry, Paul, it seems like you no longer hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we missed you. I mean, I think somehow you got muted. Thank you.
Okay, all right, sorry. So just saying I'm going to introduce the panel one by one. We have 5 of them, and each has an approximate 4 to 5 minutes to give an input. So the first one is Mr. Bongumusa Zondo, who is a senior manager for long-term development planning at the eThekwini Municipality. He is responsible for the long-term development planning within the municipality. And he joined the municipality way back in 2009 after working at national and provincial government in middle and senior management on programs meant to advance service delivery in cities and local government. He has led municipalities' review of the long-term development framework through Imagine Durban project, which was implemented in partnership with 35 global cities under the guidance and support of the Sustainable Cities International. So ladies and gentlemen, there we have Mr. Bongumusa Zondo as one of our panelists. The other panelist we have is Mr. Daniel Dunier. He is Executive Director of the African Solidarity Networks, ASONET, which is an organization promoting social cohesion with the aim of ending xenophobia and xenophobic attacks in South Africa. Mr. Daniel has served as a community scholar at the Center of Civil Society at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and is a former member of the National Working Group and KZN Provincial Coordinator of the Right to Know campaign. Mr. Daniel is also a national social cohesion advocate and has obtained a Bachelor of History and Honors of Social Science and Social Policy and Management. The next panelist is Reverend Ian Booth. He is the interim coordinator for the Konya Council of Churches, the General Secretary of the Greater Durban YMCA, a Minister of the United Congregational Church of Southern Africa, and was the chair of the Council of the Konya from 2011 to 2017. And lastly, but not least, we have Miss Cookie Edwards. I'm just going, please allow me, Miss Edwards, to just read just a brief bio. I have 2.5 pages. So if you wouldn't mind, let me just do a bit of summary. So Miss Cookie Edwards is a KZN Network of Violence Against Women Executive Director. It is based here in KZN. She has worked in the field of women's rights for more than 25 years. She has published widely, as I can see from her bio, and she's an activist by her own right, and he has presented a number of papers at national and international conferences on related issues and granted a national and international awards for honoring her achievements in this field. So ladies and gentlemen, there we have Ms. Cookie Edwards. So how are we going to go for this session? I'm going to pose a question for each of the presenter, and they are going to take 4 to 5 minutes maximum to respond to that question, so that we can continue based on our time constraints that we have right now. Now, we're going to start with Mr. Bongumusa Zondo, and then followed by Mr. Charlson. I think he's still here, if I'm not mistaken. And then we're going to be followed by Mr. Dunier, and then Ms. Edwards. And so, having heard what we've heard in the first session about the multiple models of social inclusion for urban governance, we have discovered there's quite a few things that we need to put in mind as we start this practical session of how this actual inclusion is enabled. One is to know that inclusion is everybody's business, according to the presentations we had there. There's no one left behind. In other words, it assumes a multi-stakeholder approach to make it work. And therefore, in talking this afternoon with our panelists is to see what the different stakeholders, the city, plus the civil society organizations in the panel, do in their respective responsibilities to promote inclusion. And the big question I would like them to respond is then how do we make it possible while intersecting the different aspects that we had from the previous presenters in the section that just ended. So for Mr. Zondo, what steps is the municipality taking to ensure inclusive governance at the local level, and especially protecting the vulnerable groups such as migrants, women, children, the poor, LGBTQI community? As we heard, that the issue of planning is fundamental in ensuring inclusivity, and we'd like to know how is the city responding to this? Over to you, sir. 5 minutes max.
Thanks, Paul. I hope you could hear me. I had a bit of a challenge with the sound, but I hope you could hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, thank you. I won't turn on the camera because I don't know whether it's a strength of the Wi-Fi that I have that is giving us problem. But thank you again to all the presenters that and yourself as a host of this session in this second segment. There are a number of things that the eThekwini Municipality is doing, but at least at the most we are guided by the policy that there are formal structures that are established by law. But we haven't even taken it forward to say, even if the structure is not established by the law, but if the structure is respected by the community, so we have got a responsibility to work with that structure and ensuring that the communities are part of the solutions of the things that we do. We are not perfect, but we are trying our level best, led by our political leadership. The examples that have been made already at the beginning, for example, if we look at what we have done in Bulwer Park, visioning the regeneration of Bulwer Park, the example that we have done in Umlazi, in How Long Park, similarly, the examples we have done in Wamashu Town Center, working with organized business, civil society, to see how we can improve that city, especially around safety. So demonstrate the commitment. And I think what we are learning in that is that it therefore becomes something that we could not achieve unless we were to partner. In all the examples I have mentioned, including the Kongela Park or including the work that have been done for some time in improving Warwick Avenue, it was clear that the active society themselves become a solution and equally become a vanguard of protecting their own right and then providing an innovative solution on how you could do things. At times, challenging as it may be, especially when we look at, the laws that exist, or urban laws, legislation that exist, but we have tried to navigate that to our best ability, of course, needing to some changes even in how we implement those bylaws in essence. But the practice that we have learned allows us to reflect back, and we continue to do that, even if the work that was done at a time dealing with homelessness. We do have Councillor Foza PA here, who was part of that group and then handed it over to then who became a mayor, and then still going on even today. But even on that, dealing with homelessness and safety and substance abuse, it's clear that we needed to work with universities, we needed to work with medical practitioners, NGO that focus on health, and that has given us the rise even today that we could say that we are doing our level best around homelessness. But the partnership, I think in all the things that we have been able to do and do well beyond the call of the mandate, is how we partner and work in partnering with others, even in trying times, but try to work even when we don't see eye to eye, but try to listen to each other and understand that the purpose is one, is to provide quality services to all who find themselves in eThekwini. And lately, we have seen the leadership dealing with the Afrophobia and xenophobia in the marketplaces. And I think it's a challenge that I can't say we are solving well, but I will say at least it is a commitment that we are the people living together and we can do something better to improve the quality of life within eThekwini Municipality for those who live, invest, and play in the city. Thanks, Paul.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Bongumusa. That's very insightful. Two key takeaways from that insightful conversation there is political will is there to help the city to deliver on its commitments, which is a very important key factor in making cities inclusive. And of course, the idea of partnership development. No one can do this on their own. We need each other, and we need to put our hands on the plow to really make it work. So very powerful key thoughts there, and I appreciate the effort that the city is doing in that regard. Our second panelist is Mr. Charlton, and Mr. Charlton is from the Center, the Community Organizations Resource Center, COG, and I'm sure probably they're based in Cape Town, if I'm not mistaken. He's a member of the Slum Dwellers International. So, Mr. Charlton, your institution focuses on slum dwellers. We are all aware of the service delivery deficit when it comes to the urban poor, demonstrated by the constant protests that we see in our communities across the country. So how do we ensure that the city of eThekwini, and perhaps any other city in the country, recognizes this group of people as equal citizens and ensure that they are well catered for as far as service delivery is concerned? Over to you, sir. Your 5 minutes starts now.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you for the opportunity to speak at this event. I think one of the primary things that we do, especially inside of the South African SDI Alliance, is support communities around self-organizing. And we have the support organizing happening in a very specific fashion in the form of social movements. And in our case, that's the Federation of the Urban Poor, FedUp, and the Informal Settlement Network. And these operate in various cities and provinces across South Africa. In the case of eThekwini, this alliance that we have has been pursuing this partnership with the municipality for a number of years. And part of the reason why we do this is because we pursue partnership that can be practical and that leads to real change on the ground. What this culminated in for us in the case of eThekwini was an actual signing of a memorandum of agreement. So this was quite a significant step for us. But like many things in South Africa, we might have the words inside of documents on policy, the constitution, looking very good, but we always seem to struggle when it comes to the implementation side. And this is something that we've also seen happen in the space of eThekwini with this signed document in place, but us not getting the right kind of traction on the ground. And what does this traction look like for us? And I think with regards to the question that you're asking specifically, and I'm going to touch on the issue of basic services as an example. One of the things that we do in our process is we help communities get organized using a number of tools, but one of the critical tools we have is data collection. And this form of data collection is driven by communities on the ground. It helps them to organize as well. And it can collect information that is highly valuable. Other speakers before me spoke about the need for data, the need for using that data to plan accordingly, not necessarily for the cities we want, but for the cities that exist right now. And often municipalities struggle because they don't have information around informal settlement communities. Our process helps communities to collect information, to collect very good information. We pursue these partnerships that create an opportunity for engagement and for the platform for discussion, but yet it sometimes doesn't lead to the desired results. Case in point is our eThekwini situation, where we've got a couple of things running at the same time. There's something called the Asidikelani campaign, where we monitor key aspects of service delivery inside of a number of informal settlements. In the city of eThekwini, that's over 50 settlements. Every month we check in on them. And there's identification of problems, of challenges, and this has to be fed back into the city. And one of the ways that we feel recognition can come is if there's actually active engagement between communities themselves who present these problems and the city and the various departments that could respond. I must say, in terms of our campaign and the 5 municipalities we're operating in, eThekwini has actually reached a stage where they've got a rhythm of engagement with us, and there's an agreement to check in with us every 2 weeks and at least once a month when it comes to the actual identification of the problems and looking more practically at how these can be sorted. But then looking at a longer term scale, eThekwini has approximately close to 600 informal settlements. And one of the things that we were looking to do was to help the city understand the nature of these settlements and the communities themselves to actually drive the collection of that information, because you end up getting very good information when you speak to the communities. And we've managed to set up mechanisms where, like I said at the beginning, on paper, there's a mechanism for this to happen, But the reality is that we've been tripped up by all the complications in trying to get this done. And the end result is we sit now with a situation where we've had communities who started actually collecting information that the city could very well use for planning purposes, but no way for this information to connect nicely to the city, not even a good way for the city to even try and support the collection of this information, even though the city of eThekwini has identified that it's critical to their planning processes. So I think in the discussions that we've been having today, and particularly around this word partnership, we pursue that partnership quite strongly as well. We push for communities to link to the municipalities themselves. Even today, I find myself speaking to you in this position as a support NGO person, but I'm speaking only because Mama Rose couldn't be here today, and she's one of our leaders. But we try to make that connection very practical, very real, and we try to see that there's implemented action on the ground. So I think that's the emphasis that I want to highlight you today, is that we have very good tools around organizing, around getting communities in a position where they can engage quite effectively with the city, bring massive resources to the city in the form of their own data, which could be used effectively for planning and implementation. But if you don't have a willing partner on the other end that has the right mechanisms to receive those kinds of inputs, then your informal settlement dwellers communities start feeling that demotivation, like nothing's changing. And I think some of the things that I've highlighted, especially around that data collection aspects, is to highlight on a broad scale, because here we're talking about scale, right? Where are these areas of concern and how can we address them quite quickly? And how can community and municipality work effectively? What this has meant practically on the ground. Sometimes settlements that get identified problems, municipalities might not know where they are, might not even know where the particular infrastructure is. But because of this connection and organizing of community, we're able to bring SETI right down to the level where they can identify the problem areas, even locate some of the infrastructure that they themselves cannot find because of the way that informal settlements develop. So I think I'll stop there. I've used my 5 minutes and I hope I've covered you sufficiently.
Thank you so much, Charlton. That's very insightful, the work that you and the network are doing. And as DDP, one of the things that we're really passionate about is the power of ordinary citizens to do what they need to do as active engagers with any level of governance to make sure that whatever they seek from government or from any structure that matter is delivered. And I like that concept of self-organizing, which is really a very important aspect of saying that we can contribute to the creation of a city that we want to see. And I think it's an encouragement to know that cities, communities are capacitated to do that, but even more importantly, that they are able to collect their own data. And perhaps maybe we would like to discuss that a little bit more when we get to our Q&A session, to know how do you capacitate communities, for example, to be able to collect their own data, and how is it processed to a way that it can be used by the city, for example, to make an intervention. Thank you so much, Charlton, again. And now we're going to hear from Mr. Daniel Dunier, who represents ASONET. And as we know from the acronym, ASONET is an organization that represents the plight of the migrants and refugees in South Africa, based in Durban, though. So, Mr. Daniel, violence has become a common headline in our country, and almost to an extent that we have seen whenever there is challenges, especially related to service delivery, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in general become one of those vulnerable communities that get targeted. From your experience, we would like to know how do you see migrants and asylum seekers and refugees involved in governance matters of a city in a way that is mutually beneficial? It adds value to the city as well as protects the rights and of migrants themselves as far as service delivery is concerned. Over to you, sir. Hello, Mr. Daniel. Hello, Daniel, are you there? Okay, it seems he's not on the platform yet.
Sorry, I forget to mute myself, sorry.
Oh, okay, all right, go for it.
Sorry, yes, thank you, Dr. Paul Kariuki. The situation of inclusion is still a challenge in our city. As we speak, we know that in Durban, migrants who've been trading in the CBD at workshops up to date, they are still not trading. And because of violence against them, and the only one problem for them is that because they are not from South Africa, and that makes them their life very difficult. But my take on the inclusivity is that the first step which the municipality should look at is the integration process of migrants in the city. I remember in 2015, when there was violence against foreign nationals or migrants, they came up with a concept of reintegrate someone who was not integrated at the first place. So in order to come up to avoid this violence which are happening, we need to come up with the integration mechanism or process which will make migrants integrated in the city life. My second point will be to allow in the city planning. So from the planning, to be participants from the planning, to be consulted from the planning point of view, when the city is process, but also until the end of the process. And another challenge we are having with inclusion is that in the city, especially in Durban or eThekwini municipality, there's no policy framework which includes migrants in the city. So there's a need of having a policy framework which will include migrants in the city. And this will assist to mitigate the violence in the city. My other point, which I want to raise with the city or the municipality, we had a Navi on migration and the community integration. They came up with very good funding, which the city should take into account and implement them. But up to date, the city didn't implement those recommendations from the Navi Pillay reference group. So my appeal to the city will be that the city needs to consider those recommendations from Judge Navi Pillay reference group and implement them. This will assist to avoid the violence which are happening in our city every day and every time. So in short, that is what I would like to bring up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Key takeaway there is that social integration of migrants into communities need to be speeded up, and participation in planning processes need to be inclusive. And we're going to unpack that a little bit later when we do the question and answer, because we'd like to know if there are any practical experiences, for example, from the municipality where there has been a legitimate or intention rather to bring migrants into those conversations around planning, especially if we think about the IDP. Okay, we're going now to go to Ms. Edwards and ask, I would like her to respond to the to the question around the strategies that her network have been using to make sure that their voices of the constituency that they represent are heard by the city and are involved, and the extent to which those voices and their views are involved in urban planning and governance, if there is any. Over to you, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you so much. Sorry, my camera is not working, so I apologize for that. Something went wrong with the computer. Good afternoon, everybody. The plight of women and other vulnerable groups has always been a priority, especially their vulnerability to crime and their level of participation in decision-making, whether it's in the city or in local communities. And this reduces the environmental or social factors that affect women's safety and security. It's also good to see an increase in reporting GBV cases. Just like this morning on the news, we saw that in KZN alone, there were 200 cases of 200 GBV cases, abusers that were arrested. But we mustn't forget there are many, many unreported cases which civil society deals with. We mustn't also forget that the high increase of femicide, abuse, violence, rape, and some of the aggressive dangers that inhibit women. I'm glad that the issue of refugee women came up, because one of the things that we did find out in our work was that refugee women that are not documented are very vulnerable. Even the shelters that take in gender-based violence survivors and the women and children will not take them in. So which means that they are stuck in that toxic situation. We also had cases of refugee women being exploited by their employees as in sexual favors, and they can't report because if they go to the police station, they will get sent back to their countries. So there's a lot of abuse around refugee women. The shelters are overflowing. And women and children have to go back, as I said, whether it's your South African woman, they can't go back. They have to go back, into these toxic environments as there's no option for secondary housing. We don't have an option to look at secondary housing for women and children when they come out of the shelters. So they don't have anywhere to go, which means they have to go back into those toxic environments again. Right now, what we are doing right now is we have established multi-stakeholder rapid response teams as a pilot project in 4 communities, so that there can be clear referral pathways to avoid secondary victimization to survivors of violence. This includes all the relevant stakeholders who are mandated to assist gender-based violence survivors. Just to give you an example, we started this in July last year, and to June last month, we dealt with 1,112 gender-based violence cases, just in the 1 year. So if we establish more rapid response teams in the communities, we can be able to have more options for women to come forward and report their cases. We don't have, civil society doesn't have like a central hub that they can report these cases to, their GBV cases on their data that has been collected for the month or for the quarterly reporting. We only get in the stats from SAST or Department of Justice or Department of Social Development. So we only seen what they are reporting, and yet civil society fills in a huge gap on service delivery. We are also establishing gender-based violence district networks in the province with civil society organizations, faith-based, local government structures, including gender focal persons, so that they can share information, best practices, and etc. But also to try and collect all the data of their GBV cases from the province, from civil society. We're also in the process of establishing 2 violence-free zones in 2 communities. Inanda and Amlazi have been identified as hotspots for sexual violence. So what we are saying is, okay, we all know there are hotspots in most of the communities. But instead of just talking about the hotspots, what actions are we going to take to turn them around? So what we are doing is going to create violence-free zones and include the women's safety audit in that process. Due to COVID and not being able to move around has created huge problems on service delivery to GBV clients. So another strategy that we came up with was we created the KZN GBV Coalition WhatsApp group with about 140 organizations in the province. This includes the gender-based violence director from the Premier's office, gender focal persons at municipalities, and many others. And we're also in the process of creating a provincial database of service providers on GBV. The reason we're also doing this is because you find that there isn't clear referral pathways for survivors of gender-based violence. And we have done community dialogues where we were promoting all this in partnership with eThekwini Municipality. We've done the NSP, the National Strategic Planning Workshop with the gender focal person from the municipality, which needs to be rolled out to other municipalities in the province. We also part of the provincial gender-based violence technical working group, because you find that service delivery at local level is not working. People complain about police, their attitudes, their insensitivity to issues, social workers not been found after hours or on weekends to help and assist with cases. They only work from Monday to Friday. There's a whole lot of issues on the ground. So that was one of the reasons or the purpose for why this provincial gender-based violence technical working group was created. Sorry, I'm not sure how much time do I have left.
You got a minute left.
Okay. So what we want to do now, we want to, in the process of creating these 2 violence-free zones, including the safety audits that we're going to do in that. Because if actions are not taken to address the safety concerns that are identified, then there's no real improvement that will occur. And the usefulness of the safety audit is diminished. The community participants, because you have to involve them, they become discouraged and they feel like they're not doing nothing that will make a difference. So the action must go beyond just making the links to really bridging the gaps right now. I think the lady from New York or somewhere spoke about crime prevention through environmental design. That is very important because that looks at your structural design and not just the design of a community. We also need to take into consideration that the functionality of war rooms at ward level must the communities need to understand their role because they can become very powerful referral networks, but there also needs to be accountability. They need to integrate their services at community level. There needs to be networking mechanisms because if there's a survivor of gender-based violence and she's not getting the satisfaction that she needs at one of the service providers, there must be a place that they can report. So that's part of your accountability. I'm going to stop there because there's a lot more to say. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much, Ms. Edwards. That's very insightful. And once again, the great work that you guys are doing in the network to make sure that the voices of the vulnerable are heard by the ears and need to hear them. But at the same time, also that you're working hard to create structures that will enable solving of those challenges. And I think this is why a platform like this one's really become useful, because as many of us get to hear the kind of work that you guys are doing, become supportive. I like the idea of collecting data, which had been mentioned also by Mr. Charlton a while ago, which is very important. And that seems to me like a gap that civil society should be complementing rather than just relying on data that comes from established structures on institutions such as SAST, South African Police Services and others who collect that kind of data on a continuous basis. I think it's very important that civil society and a network like yours especially be able to do that kind of work from the grassroots so that we can do comparison of data of what is presented officially versus what you guys see on the ground. And I'm sure we can pick up that conversation in our Q&A session. And I would like to encourage colleagues who are still on the platform, please feel free to continue posting your questions on the platform. We're going to give our panelists a chance to respond to them before we move into the next session. And our last panelist is Mr. Daniel, not Mr. Daniel, but Reverend Ian Booth, who, as we said, he works for the Diaconia Council of Churches. And we know that the Diaconia Council of Churches is almost like a home away from home for many of our citizens in the city. Whenever there are challenges, they find a place that they can go and take shelter of home before an intervention is found. So, Mr. Booth, would you like to tell us what are some of the issues that the Diaconia Council of Churches have been grappling with lately as far as city dwellers are concerned, and what kind of responses have you received from the city? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. So Diaconia traditionally has been a space for social justice. Some of the issues we've needed to deal with have been, for example, the traders that have been removed from the workshop and not been able to continue trading there. At Diaconia, it's been a base for sessions providing hearings, opportunities for people to express their concerns, their frustrations. And they will continue as we seek to find ways of finding justice within the city. I need to say that as a council of churches, one of our challenges is that the institutional religions, the church, Muslim, the mosques, the synagogues, institutional religion is often one of the major contributors to division, judgment, separation of people. And that's one of our challenges at Diaconia as we engage with the community and as we seek to work in partnership with and not on behalf of communities, is to emphasize the fact that our religions should be about relationships with God and with one another, and not about judgment and dividing each other. So it's really a case of how do we work in partnership? How do we, as Diaconia churches, facilitate the connections between the various communities and facilitate conversations? Because that's really what I see our role. We need to be the ones who are helping people connect and find solutions, but the emphasis being on partnerships. The church I belong to, for example, is a multinational church. We exist in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. So when there's violence against foreigners, it's often people from our own church constituency that are in victims of that violence. And that's why as churches we need to see, we've all been in our different religious sectors refugees at some stage or another. And we need to be inclusive in our engagement with communities, with the city, and find justice for all.
Thank you so much, Reverend Ian Booth. And it's true that religious community plays a very great role in building the social fabric that we need to see in our society, and the continued role that the Diaconia Council of Churches continue to play in promoting social justice in our city and in the province at large. And I think the role that the center plays can never be underemphasized. And so thank you so much for those comments. Again, emphasizing the point of partnerships across communities and with other stakeholders to make our cities really more livable and with a lot more tolerance across different race groups and ethnicities across our city. At this point, I would like to thank all our panelists for sharing their input in the first section. I see some questions that have been posted on our chat room. I see the first one was directed to Mr. Sitole, and I'm not so sure whether he is still here. He had indicated he will leave for another engagement. But I think it's an important question which perhaps maybe the organizers can be able to pose to him so that he can provide some answers at some way, in some form. How is the city's network responding to issues of including refugees in their planning processes? And I think that's a very important question that needs some clarity. As we're saying here that Mr. Daniel, in his input, did comment that they are rarely involved. And it will be important to hear from the city's network to what extent do they include their voices of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers in their planning processes, if there is any. Then we have Crescentia Nyati posted 2 questions, and I would like to know to whom were they directed. I'm suspecting to Mr. Bongumusa because they relate to municipality. And you're free, Bongumusa, to direct that to any of your colleagues if they are on the platform. But the question is, why are there delays from the municipality whenever vulnerable groups are attacked in the city? And the second question is, which long-term programs are being undertaken to address the safety of minority groups? I think that's a very important question that needs a response. I see another question directed to Mr. Bongumusa again, to go into detail from these questions from Sarah. to go into detail about what was done in Bulwer Park and Warwick Triangle, as he had mentioned in his input. And I see Daniel's question is almost similar to Crescence's one about how the migrants who are voluntarily moved from the workshop, a few months ago, what has been the city's plan to address the challenge, and especially in this context of being inclusive. So I'll hand over to Mr. Bongumusa to respond to those 3 questions, and then we'll pick up the others as directed. I see some of those have been responded to, but Mr. Bongumusa, would you kindly just respond to those?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to all the questions. And I'll also invite some of my colleagues who are in attendance to make input on some of the matters I may have maybe ignored or somehow not given clarity on. On the issue of the traders that were affected by the workshop, AfriFoba and Ethiopia attacks, we do know that the city has been working together with some of them, and in my inquiry was that the ASONET was part of the solution and other organized civil society to look at how we could create an environment where non-South African nationals could trade side by side with South African traders, looking at the issue of the allocation of space, and equally also looking at how they could work together because of, on the issues of how they collectively order their stock and support each other, since we accept that the unique nature of the city of eThekwini, of having an informal trading being a key part of the economy is very important. It hasn't been an easy way, but we know that the mayor has taken it to himself and the top leadership, as well as us in the operational level, to see how we could explore that arrangement. But of course, it requires that we partner with many other people beyond maybe ASONET, which we know best, and also looking at the issue of crime prevention and violence prevention. So that in cases where there is criminality, beyond even looking at creating an enabling environment for non-South African nationals and South African nationals to trade in a similar space, but where there is criminality and equally the stereotypes, or hatred of each other, which the mayor is leading. You will also remember the social inclusion session that have been held, and the one that have been meant, that is currently under planning to bring together this strength of the city of being a diverse city with people of African descent and all others from other part of the world. So it's not an easy work, but to go further is to link this to crime and prevention. We do know that in the CBD and in eThekwini in general, we do have a problem with crime and violence, and the CBD is one of those areas where most people feel unsafe. So it's not only the violence and crime perpetrated to non-South African national, but we need to deal with fundamental cause of crime across everybody else who find themselves in the inner city and within eThekwini, of course, within
So we've lost the last commentary from Bongumusa, but I think we understood his trail of thought. The city.
Sorry.
All right, go ahead.
I'm sorry. There's a challenge with the strength of the broadband that I'm using. Can you still hear my voice?
Yes, we can still hear. You can go on.
Yeah. So on the crime and violence prevention, beyond looking at social inclusion and social cohesion, which is led also by the mayor's office, working with different partners, including internal units as well as organized business and organized society. We also work tirelessly with organized business, South African Safer City, police service, Metro Police, on the project, national project led by the Minister of Police and the Deputy Minister on Integrated Safer Cities, with 7 key pillars. One of them looking at how we deal with social inclusion, address the challenges faced by those that are marginalized and excluded, and then also how we use technology. And key to that, Cookie Edward mentioned it, how we maintain our public realm, in essence. And then we do know the Operation Good Hope in the city, not only dedicated to CBD, but equally other towns, including Spingo, Verulam, and Pinetown, Tongati and Pinetown. So that program is so important in such a way that we deal with crime in its totality. Of course, with targeted effort in the cases where there is crime perpetrated against non-South African nationals. I think I'll stop there for now, then I will come back and elaborate on the work that was long done by ATRAM, even during the time of inception, at a time led by Richard Dobson, eventually by Hussein Mula, Tulani Nzama, but equally working with the organized society as well as the university. We remember the work that they were able to achieve at a time with Carol Skinner and others, but I will come back to that, as well as the reference that I made to Bulwer Park, Kongela Park, as well as Howlong Park. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bongomusa. I really appreciate that. I know our time is really moved. We'll see if we have some time to give you back about 2 or so minutes to talk about that. I would like to read a comment from Blessing Yuso around the issue of top-down policy apparently doesn't work, and it frustrates any motion towards building social cohesion and creating opportunities for inclusiveness. Very interesting commentary there. And that's why I think a platform like this one gives us an opportunity to start exploring possible bottom-up approaches that can work together. And I like to underscore the comment by Bongomusa around building and strengthening partnerships with all stakeholders beyond just the well-known or those who have been very active, interacting with the city. The more the civil society gets organized and is able to interact with the city with meaningful approaches, the better. I recognize that Cookie Edwards has her hand up. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question, Cookie?
It's not actually a question, it's a comment. I want to say that the city also needs to look at the informal and formal structures and how does it contribute to abuse and violence, because cities have their own dynamics and their own history. The transit spaces also encourage violence and abuse because people are coming into the city, they cannot put down roots and there's no sense of attachment or solidarity, and this makes women or the people more vulnerable to the scourge of violence. But if all these factors are taken into consideration, and the city puts in a properly designed and coordinated partnership between local governments or the cities with the participation of the communities, that bottom-up approach, we would be able to create safer cities and communities. Because one of the things that we also pick up in our work is that people always feel that safety is regarded the sole responsibility of the police. Because there's a perception that policing is the only solution to the problem of insecurity. So to make people feel safe, or women and children safe, there has to be an urgency for a paradigm shift in the approach of tackling safety and security issues, which means that it comes back to holistic, integrated, collaborative, and multi-sectoral approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cookie Edwards. That's very powerful. It's everyone's business to make sure that we promote our city as a safe space for everyone, and it requires all our interaction with the different agencies that we have in the city to make it work. I would like to read also a comment by somebody by the name Mariana, who says community engagement and inclusion starts when we include communities to make informed decisions and give them the opportunity to take ownership of projects for self-sustainable development within their own communities, I believe. Very well said. I would like to give Bongomusa again a chance here to come back in and share his thoughts around the Warwick Triangle and the work that was done by Richard Dobson, the iTrump. All right.
I mean, Paul, this work is well known, and I'm starting it as far as at the time of inception of the iTram. I mean, that the at the time Warwick Avenue was really improved, but of course it doesn't say that we haven't at some time kind of take a little bit of a step back in some of the cases. But if you look at the work, I mean, the Bovan Head area, the market. But again, if you look at that, it was the city working hand in hand with the traders already and coming up with solutions, collectively owned solutions in that particular case. And then I can even stretch that and goes to the informal recyclers, the cardboard recyclers that we started around 2016 and eventually created a recycling stock exchange by the ICC. So again, it wasn't an easy work. And again, I don't think the city on its own, I mean, I'm a public servant myself, that we could have achieved what we're able to achieve unless we're working with a trusted partner being Asia Etafuleni, and then business support also embracing the matter that these people were those who were included, I mean, involved in cardboard recycling were equally abused by the private sector in a way, and eventually coming up, engaging with them, at times living with them on their journey of how they collect boxes along the street, the pain and the anger they face from fellow residents when they pull their trolleys of cardboard in town, you know, let alone being pushed aside by cars. So, but eventually we had a particular lesson that we could then improve. Of course, I would say, I mean, despite those lessons, we haven't been able then to take that and scale up as much as we would have wished to. There are a number of dynamics, including how we look at our urban legislation. Similarly, the visioning we did in Bulwer Park to what you see today as Bulwer Park, at a time where we're even told that we had a fence Bulwer Park, and we refused and said, no, we are not fencing Bulwer Park, because there were people who were then given a tag of unwanted people, kind of thing, because they were homeless living in the park. But we worked through that, and then we say we are not fencing it. We had a visioning, and then we were laughed by everybody else, including the then Councillor Barros, when we said that we had no plan as to what to do in Bulwer Park, but we will only get a plan after the visioning with the communities. And we were so happy that the then we prepared the primary offered us a space to meet the communities. It was in time of COVID. We met, we engaged, we fight. Eventually, our architects came up with some plan, having listened to the people. And then child-friendly cities led by Samantha Willen help us to have an engagement with kids by organizing a play session in Bulwer Park in line with UN Convention on the right to play. And eventually, this is what we see now in Bulwer Park as an improved Bulwer Park that is loved by many. And again, now we got other complaints of saying people are staying for long in Bulwer Park at night and making noise in outdoor gym. But again, these are the things that we are trying. And again, the community was centered in this. Same thing applies in the Kongela Park. With the support of Umbilo Business Forum, by the way, I must indicate that they have done so well there, embracing people who are homeless and then supporting them to get in the business of society and other things. In a similar way, Babumlangeni, why you section Mdazi, did the same with How Long Park until the city embraced the initiative by a community member and then take it forward. I think I should hold it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Bongumusa, for that insightful commentary. And it's just that our time really, because it's gone so much, we could have delved deeper into those particular aspects, and just even to understand how the city has supported those organized structures that have been able to promote the ideals of the city towards making sure that no one is left behind in terms of their needs. And in wrapping up this session, I would like to give each panelist as strictly a minute just to say one last word about what do they think from their own sectoral representation should the city take forward as far as inclusive governance is concerned. We've run out of time, but I would like to give you a minute each before I give to Dr. Jean-Pierre. So if we could start with, we'll end with Bongumusa because he just spoke last. Could I start with Ms. Cookie Edwards? One last comment, don't explain, just one sentence. What could the city do to enhance inclusivity of your network?
More strengthen the partnerships with community, civil society, and government. That's what we need. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Strengthening partnerships. Mr. Charlton?
Follow through on the commitments that we've worked so hard to document and get to implementation action on those commitments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlton. Follow through the commitments that you worked so hard to put together. Appreciate that. Mr. Daniel?
Yes, my point is that we need migrant to be included in city planning, but also the city need to have policy on migration. Thank you.
All right, the city needs to have policy on migration and so that they can be constructively included. Reverend Booth?
The important thing is to listen to what the people want and develop plans around what the people want, not what the city thinks the people want.
Thank you so much.
On an authority.
Thank you very much for that. Listening to the people so that their plans are aligned to their aspirations and their needs. And the last comment from Mr. Bongumuza.
Really humbling, and I think we commit to carry on listening and working with partners to advance the change that we all deserve.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that comment. Willing to listen, willing to engage, to support the work that you'd want to see the city doing together with the networks that have been established to participate in the processes that makes our city a more inclusive one and more livable one according to the vision of our city. All right, at this junction, I would like to hand over to Dr. Jean-Pierre to do the conclusive remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Paul, for excellent moderation. Good afternoon, everyone. So I've been given the simplest task of thanking you all for participating in this dialogue. In particular, I'd like to thank the city of eThekwini for taking the lead in driving this initiative. Through Bongo Musa Zondo and the other colleagues, they have really shown commitment that they really want this to happen. And it fits into their vision, what they're trying to do. And that is demonstrated by the participation of the speaker in this dialogue. The participation really shows or demonstrates the city's commitment to build an inclusive city for everyone. On the side of ACMS, I would like to thank Hakima for all she did to working with the city to make this happen. Really, your efforts are appreciated. Next, I would like to thank our moderators, Mr. Sitore and Dr. Kariuki for great moderation. Your contribution are very much appreciated. Of course, last but not least, all the speakers and participants for their useful input. From all the contribution, for all the interventions of this afternoon, it's very clear that we acknowledge that governing for urban inclusion is not just the responsibility of the local state or city officials. It can only be achieved through partnerships with government, private sector, academia, civil society, and at all levels. And indeed, governance does not necessarily mean government. Governance of any space, any locality, any polity involves not just the state, but also informal stakeholders at different levels, different actors at different levels. This is the reason why when we were trying to put together this dialogue, we thought of inviting all stakeholders from the community, from the academia, from the city, of course, to bring all those voices together to see how we can reflect on the issue we're discussing today. We have not been able to reach everyone. This is our first dialogue, and we hope it's going to be the first of many more to come. And we hope future dialogues are going to include more stakeholders who are working in the sector. We really believe that this kind of dialogue is important, and it can significantly contribute to efforts the city is making to achieve its vision of being the most caring and livable city for all. And we can see from the commitment by the speaker, by the itself, by Bongo Musa, that we are willing to listen to partner everybody to make sure this this mission is achieved, realized. So we thank you all for that. Next step, we are going to take these dialogues to other cities, starting with the city of Johannesburg, and then the city of Cape Town, and other cities will follow. And we will invite all of you to attend if you can, and so that we can be able to learn from other contexts. In the end, what we are trying to do here is to build what we call local communities of practice, where local people in Durban, without us coming from Johannesburg or from anywhere else, can continue this kind of conversations, can continue supporting the city to achieve its mission that is already set. And we are really pleased to hear that the city is willing to listen to partner with everybody to be able to make this a reality. With that, I really thank you very much for your participation and your input. Thank you. So Hakima, I think this is the end of our dialogue. I thank you all for participation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, JP. Thank you, all the participants and everybody that contributed to this dialogue.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
What do you want to do? You gotta speak. You gotta put on.
Enkosi wetuna. Bye.